Welcome to Complaints on a Podcast, the real, actual podcast that really exists in the world, and evidence of that is growing every day. Just recently, we've had the latest piece of evidence that shows that this is a real podcast, which is that in an actual real book that exists in the world, Heather has been quoted, and it says, Heather of Complaints on a Podcast. And that book is Weaponising Anti-Semitism by Asa Winstanley. And Asa Winstanley joins us now. Hello, Asa.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, everyone else is here as well.
Lovely to have you.
Yeah, we've got Claudia. Yeah. So, Weaponising Anti-Semitism. What I liked about it was, I think for people on this channel, a lot of it, personally, I knew quite well. I think a lot of our listeners would know, but there were a lot of stuff that I didn't know that we'll get into. It's quite interesting. But what I liked about it was that there's been so much of the information about what you've written about the sort of the narrative around anti-Semitism and what's sort of come to light countering that narrative in the last few years. It's all kind of come in little bits here and there. And some of it, you're not sure exactly if it's correct, what to believe, what's right. And I think what it does is it really sort of clearly shows how the narrative was created in the first place while Corbyn was leader, the sort of, this huge idea about this massive crisis of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And then how that's sort of slowly been revealed to be basically bullshit. And I think that's really important that you have like a book like this that you can kind of follow that. Because we've tried to do podcasts on it, and some of them have been hopefully quite helpful, but it's very hard to put it all together. And I think you've done a really good job in that regard.
Well, thank you for saying that, Daniel. It's good to hear that. That's what I was going for. I faced the same problem that I've reported, like you on this podcast. I've reported on it a lot over the years. I reported on it all the way through from 2015, and there was so much. Can we swear on this podcast? I think you can.
Yeah.
Okay. There's so much shit that happened that it's impossible to keep track of it all. And I don't write everything that happened in the book because that would be impossible. But I tried to show the most, what I thought were indicative examples and the most sort of high profile examples. And I tried to, lay out the key points in what happened just for history, really, and to hopefully maybe start a conversation about how to avoid something like that happening again in the future. I don't really have all the answers for that, but I hope that we can sort of at least hopefully start to learn some of the lessons. Even same as you, like I thought I knew it all. But when you actually sit down and write, start to write the story from beginning to end, I had to choose what went into it. And then as you write, you start to realize other things and make other connections. So it was good.
Well, I've made videos about it, and we call it the never ending story, because it's this rolling narrative that everything else that happens to the left is sort of swept up in, particularly in the UK and in the Labour Party. And you were saying, you didn't know what parts to add. I imagine you didn't know exactly when to end the story, right? Because obviously Fallout might be the longest chapter, and obviously that is open-ended in itself. And just this week, or was it last week, we've had this Roger Waters malarkey going on. And it just seems like every month or so, there's something that comes out that feeds into this.
It's not every month. I started doing a list at one stage because one of the videos I thought of doing was just doing an update. And it was every few days. But literally, there's something happens all the time. It's kind of relentless. And that's just the visible stuff. Like, I guess you're aware as well, like I am. There'll be people who'll come to you and say, this has happened or that's happened. And it's not public. So a lot of this stuff is going under the radar. Exactly. And it's happening multiple times every day with councillors and members and stuff, as well as the high profile stuff. Like that.
There's really, the book is the tip of the iceberg in a lot of ways. Absolutely. There was so much stuff, told so many stories over the years, you know, a lot of them, like, wasn't even allowed to report. People were talking to me on background. They were too intimidated. But I say that, you know, I mentioned some cases of that in the book, of students or younger people sometimes who talked to me about it on the phone, and then when it came down to it, wouldn't go on the record just because of jobs or, you know, future in the Labour Party or future out of the Labour Party, just careers and things like that. And it was, it was really hard to know. I mean, it was hard. You're right, Daniel. It was hard to know where to end the book, and I just had to cut it off at a certain point. And just the whole process of editing. Every time we did a new edit of the book, you know, whether it was a substantial edit or a copy edit or legal advice, there was a temptation to add more stuff, but I had to keep it to, you know, the most important points.
Well, we'll get into, I really want to talk about, there's a few things I want to get into a bit later. Ruth Smeeth, got to have a whole section on Ruth Smeeth. That'll be fun. There was why I thought was interesting that we'll touch on is like woke rhetoric, like the way that you talk about the tactic to sort of use progressive language as part of the argument. One thing you omitted, and I think would be good to have in Labour, would just be mention Mike Gapes. Just having, I don't know how you could just get him in somehow. We're guilty of it on this podcast. We don't talk about him enough, but I think we should mention him every episode. But what I want to start with is how you start in the book, which is looking at, I don't want to get too much into the actual cases that you talk about, the University College Union case, which is a basically kind of mini anti-Semitism crisis, sort of mirroring what later happens in the Labour Party. And I just want to talk about that because I want to talk about the sort of broad ways that the campaign against the union, what was sort of done in that campaign and how that happened in the Labour Party and how that sort of happens all over the place. Because when we talk about the anti-Semitism crisis in Labour, you know, you talk about the media narrative that there was this big crisis, and there was loads of anti-Semites. And then there's this idea of denialism, that people didn't believe that was the case. What you put in your book is the arguments for why people deny it, why people think that something else was afoot, right? That it wasn't just that people were just being honest when they said that it was overrun with anti-Semites. And they had to leave the party, they were so scared, right? This is like some of the arguments for what you think was actually happening in the Labour Party to sort of foster this narrative, right? So I'd like to look at two things that you bring up early on, and then you sort of show how that work, they go on that go. I don't want to say they, you know, the people that do the evil works, the Jews. No, sorry, not them. Although some of them are, some of them aren't. But yeah,
them.
Jewish. This is a 67% Jewish podcast, right? So, like, we're pretty good here, right?
Yeah, but we're the wrong sort of Jews, so don't count.
We're not the conspiring sort.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into talking about.
Am I allowed to laugh at these jokes? Is that? Well, I've done it now. So.
It's all right. You can chat at Labour Party. There's nothing else I can do.
Yeah. We can make the jokes, but you can't laugh. You have to sit there like, no, this is not on. All right. So So one of the things you talk about is lawfare. And the other one, I think, is the accusation of denialism.
Yeah. Can you define lawfare? Because I think it's, for a lot of people, it's quite confusing. It took a while before I got my head around what it was.
Yeah, I mean, lawfare is just essentially the use of lawyers to harass usually activists, but anyone really. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. That it's a strategy to, and sometimes that is the actual term that they use. So there's an organization.
Who are they? Who do you mean by they? What's that? No, but actually,
well, it could be anyone. You know, it could be right-wing lobbyists. It could be.
So you mean the people that use the tactic?
It could be any. Yeah. It could be anyone who has lawyers, basically, who has got money and lawyers that they're using it to sort of suppress free speech or to suppress grassroots activism. And there's an organization actually called the Lawfare Project. I believe it's in the States. I know my colleagues at Electronic Intifada have written about it, so I'm not that familiar with it. I know it's I think it must be at least partly involved in the Israel lobby, if not in other issues. But it essentially, it's a strategy that the Israel lobby and other right-wing organizations and groups use a fair bit, because, you know, when you've not got popular support for your, you know, agenda, you need to do something, and quite often that is using lawfare. So, you know, it's a kind of a broad term which could mean anything from, you know, suing people for libel to just tying people up in bad headlines. So the UCU thing that you alluded to, you mentioned a bit earlier, was a good example of that in the book.
Yeah. So in that particular case, there was what exactly was the sort of charge against the union? And why would you call that lawfare? Exactly how did it work in that way?
Okay, so the University and College Union it came together as an amalgam of two predecessor unions, and I forget their names now, but before they united into one union,
I know what this, because I was in them. So it's NATFE and AU2, right? So okay. It's the union that represented universities, traditional universities, and the union represented polytechnics and colleges of further education.
Right. So they came together into one big old, you know, university college union, which was supposed to be for all kind of educators. Before that amalgamation, there was discussion and debate within the unions of the possibility, you know, Palestine solidarity activists within the union, quite a lot of them Jewish, incidentally, people like Jonathan Rosenhead and so forth, who are now in Jewish Voice for Labour, were trying to encourage debate within the union about joining the academic boycott of Israel. So supporting boycott of Israeli academic institutions that are complicit in the Israeli occupation, in the military occupation of Palestinians in the West Bank and so forth, and the apartheid state of Israel. And incidentally, the academic boycott of Israel is quite narrow, it's quite strict, it's quite disciplined. It's not like, so the South Africa boycott, during the apartheid era, the boycott of South Africa was very broad. It was basically boycotting anything South African. But according to the Palestinian bodies, the BDS National Committee and its academic advisory body PACB, it's very narrow. It doesn't boycott all Israelis. It doesn't boycott all Israeli academics. It boycotts complicit Israeli institutions, academic institutions. Okay, be that as it may, there was this discussion within the union, and basically the Israel lobby just went hell for leather to crush this, and they did it through lawfare. And then they carried out there was this legal case taken out against the UCU for what they alleged was discrimination, namely, and this will sound familiar, institutional anti-Semitism. This was the term that they used. And when I say they, the Israel lobby in this case was an alliance of various pro-Israel groups in the UK, mainly led by the Jewish Leadership Council, which was, at the time, the chief executive was Jeremy Newmark, who later became the chairperson of the Jewish Labour movement within the Labour Party.
So there's an amazing crossover between people that are in these organisations and then sort of move into the Labour Party when Corbyn becomes leader, and they see him as someone that they would like to use these kind of tactics on. But staying with the UCU, so this was an internal discussion in the union about whether they were going to back a boycott. But these organizations that sort of labeled the union as having some problem with anti-Semitism, being institutionally anti-Semitic, they're outside the union.
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
So they had kind of a front man, a pro-Israel activist named Ronnie Fraser, who was a member of the union. He was a retired maths lecturer, so as he was a legitimate member of the union, but behind him he had all this apparatus. And I saw it, I saw it in court. I actually reported from court at the time, and there was all these people in suits, and it's like, who the hell are all these people? I wasn't this was back in 2012, and I wasn't as 2011 2012, because it went on for a long time. I wasn't as familiar with the Israel lobby then as I am now. It was sort of an education process. And their barrister was Anthony Julius, who was Princess Diana's lawyer, divorce lawyer, one of the partners of Mishkon Dereya, this really high-profile law firm, which has also incidentally acted for the State of Israel in other cases. So it was an odd case, because the forum chosen for it was actually an employment tribunal, which I've never fully understood, because what it was, lawyers try to explain it to me, but it still doesn't make really much sense to me. But I guess this is just the way it's done. Ronnie Fraser, who I mentioned as the frontman for this case, he was a member of this union, so he was taking apparently the forum, if you want to sue your union for discrimination, is an employment tribunal. So, but it was a real court. It had a panel of judges, three, a judge and two
executioners.
Yeah. So it was, and the verdict was quite devastating.
As in, there was no case there, right? They threw it out.
Yeah, exactly. It was absolutely like it lost comprehensively. Like, it's still, a decade, and this was 2013. The verdict was ruled, and we still read it decades later. It makes a fun read because it says. It basically accused. Judges are not exactly known for forthright language, but it basically accuses Jeremy Newmark of being a liar. It says he gave untrue evidence, and preposterous. Some of what he said was preposterous, and all this kind of stuff. So in legal terms, it lost, like, shatteringly so. But, and this is a really key point, I think, for lessons for the Labour Party, which the Labour Party under Corbyn never at all learned, unfortunately, is that although it technically lost, it was kind of a success, because the point was really to drag it out. The point was to create bad headlines for the union and to get it to back down. And we don't see any academic boycott of Israel within the UCU now. So
yeah.
And it's interesting, because it strikes me that, like, that was a time when you hadn't got this big national narrative about anti-Semitism and the problem with it, and how we all have to, like, take it very seriously as, like, it's rising and it's difficult. And do you think the judgment would be different now, because that narrative would then impact the way in which the evidence was seen?
I think, yeah, you're right.
Jeremy Newmark is a liar. It's quite a difficult thing to say now, really.
Yeah, I think that it would be very difficult. The British legal system is on a bit of a rampage right now against activists in general. But I think it would, and I think in general, because of all this atmosphere of the anti-Semitism smears, it would be very difficult for that verdict to be reached now. It would be very hard. And actually, when the verdict was reached, the response of Jeremy Newmark and people like David Hirsch, David Hurst, not David Hirsch, David Hurst, the Goldsmiths University lecturer, who's incredibly pro-Israel from an ostensibly liberal viewpoint, allegedly, where their response was basically to say, "Oh well, the judge is anti-Semitic," not in so many words, but that was basically what they were saying. And
that's where the denialism comes in, right? So you start this. I suppose you set off the narrative by making a legal case that there is an issue at an institution. There's an issue with anti-Semitism against me and as an individual, or against a handful of people, or because of some of the positions they're taking politically. And then any fight back against that is part of the problem of anti-Semitism, in that exactly now they're denying there is a problem. So it's a bigger problem than we even thought. And
it was exactly the same thing. And if you looked at the so-called evidence of what actually happened, you get into the nitty-gritty of it. And I reported it for Electronic Intifada at the time. It was really ridiculous. Like, Jeremy Newmark was trying to say that, Ronnie Fraser was being shouted down, and that Jeremy Newmark had been denied entry to the UCU conference floor because he was visibly Jewish and wearing a skull cap. Well, it turned out there was audio recordings which the judges listened to, and that's what they called preposterous, because it turned out he wasn't booed, jeered, or insulted at all. They listened to his pro-Israel speech and let him do his speech, and then the other side gave their contribution to the debate. Jeremy Newmark was denied entry to the UCU conference floor because he wasn't a delegate to UCU conference, so he didn't have the proper credentials. He was trying to say he was denied entry to conference as a Jew, which was completely untrue and what the judge called preposterous. So it was it was a very deliberate sort of smear campaign.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, what really struck me reading it is that ultimately, although the judge is quite damning, it really didn't matter. They still worked that into their campaign. And something I look into quite a lot is domestic violence dynamics and coercive control. And when I was reading it, it's quite triggering to read the book, because it's the same process that you have when you have high profile abusers using the family courts, or abusing the victims into silence. And it was just really shocking to me that, you've got evidence time and time again in your book, especially in this case, but because of the power in play and because of prejudice already against certain activists and people on the left, it was able to be used as part of the attack. It felt completely hopeless reading it. It was very depressing.
I shouldn't laugh, but it was a really I've had several people say those exact words. It's quite.
It's also
Thank you.
Yeah, it's brilliant, but
it is. No, I mean, I hear what you're saying. Like, I mean, look, I wanted to stop writing about this. I didn't want to write this book. Like, it is depressing, and it is. I had somebody actually who I can't name, a former senior Labour staffer, who said it was triggering, because it in all seriousness, it is still a traumatic event, which I think the grassroots British left, let's say, to put it that way, has gone through. And you're right. I mean, this is a really vital point that you make, Claudia. It's the abuse, and everything they say is sort of projection. It is abuse and gaslighting.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we've said is it's really awful. We're doing all these podcasts about this issue of anti-Semitism Labour Party, and it's horrible, but it's better to be doing that than not doing that, if that makes sense, even though it's horrible to talk about, because at least we're getting it out. And when I was reading, I was thinking, like, the other thing about lawfare is that it kind of forces you to defend every single claim. So you're kind of going through and saying, actually, there was video of this, and you have to do that. And as soon as you defend against any of the claims, you give them validity. You see them, you present them as worthy of response. And I think that's part of the problem. I think the focus on the disciplinary system is a kind of lawfare, because it is a kind of substructure within the Labour Party that's quasi-judicial, and it forces you to go into that kind of mode where it's much harder to kind of have a political response to it. And I think we see it all the way through. I think the EHRC was a kind of lawfare, and the use of reports. And we see it actually now. The guy you mentioned, David Hurst, is making claims of institutional anti-Semitism against goldsmiths. And they're doing a report now about Goldsmiths University.
I saw that. Crazy. Yeah.
Which is it's the same pattern, right? Or over and over and over again. And
that could be quite good, though, because I went there. I went to Goldsmiths.
I did.
And I'm Jewish, and I didn't get a great degree. So could play it to my favor. That see how that goes.
I need my degree reassessed.
Yeah,
and I'm Jewish.
It's historic allegations of anti-Semitism. Actually, you quote the judge in your book, and I think this is quite a good definition of warfare. So the judge says at the end of the trial, talking about Newmark's case, an impermissible attempt to achieve a political end by litigious means. And I think that's quite a nice summing up.
The classic line. Yeah.
Classic judge. I mean, I can't imagine having a conversation with a judge. The way they talk is unbelievable.
But that was great. That was, I remember at the time when I reported it, my headline was something like "Crushing Defeat for Israel Lobby" or something. I was quite.
But like you say, as you said, Heather, the damage was done to the union, and like you say, so do they have a boycott against Israel now? No, they don't. So it doesn't. It's sort of immaterial whether you win or lose the case. But what happens is you have this 2-3 year battle where your union is associated with anti-Semitism.
I agree to an extent, but I would say it was still an important victory because it would have been so much worse if it had been, if the vote had been the other way around.
I suppose I'm sort of moving the conversation towards the Labour Party that lost the election, we could say, and I mean, we'll talk about the EHRC, not really saying very much, but it doesn't really matter. It said something, and that was enough for it to be.
It said the Labour Party broke the law,
but not because of anti-Semitism, right?
Doesn't matter. In a report about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, it said the Labour Party broke the law. That's all it had to do. Everything else.
I want to make a point about the HRC. I want to get into that, but I want to make a couple of points about what Heather said about the use of these kind of institutions within and reports and this kind of disciplinary apparatus. The first point to make is that it was interesting to see the difference between the problems we had while we were still in the Labour Party, because compared to the United States, which, the Democrats is not a real political party in the sense that, there's not really a mass membership like the Labour Party had, although it's now been purged. And so, it's kind of a bad thing. But on the other hand, at least it meant that Bernie Sanders supporters couldn't really be purged to the same way we were. They could just sort of be, there could be sort of harassment and smears of them, but there was no, there was no party disciplinary body for the Jewish Chronicle to call up and say this Bernie Sanders supporter said this terrible thing on Facebook that you need to get out of the party. And the other thing is to say about that kind of pattern of sort of almost guerrilla warfare. Well, that's maybe that's the wrong analogy because the guerrillas are usually not the bad guys. But in any case, this kind of strategy is conscious by pro-Israel lobbyists. And there's a bit in the book where I mention a quote from the Al Jazeera's Lobby USA series, which was never actually shown on Al Jazeera, but it was undercover in the American Israel lobby. And the undercover reporter infiltrated the pro-Israel group, the Israel on Campus Coalition, which said that it coordinated with Israel's, coordinated its so-called intelligence with Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And there was a classic part of that film where they said that I've got my book up here. It says one pro-Israel lobbyist described anti-Semitism allegations as, quote, psychological warfare. It drives them crazy. The students, because obviously they're attacking pro-Palestinian or pro-Palestinian students on campus. The students, quote, either shut down or they spend time responding to it and investigating it. And that's incredibly effective, unquote. That's exactly what we saw in the Labour Party. There's a very conscious, deliberate strategy by the pro-Israel lobby. And he was, the guy was talking in terms of counterinsurgency. He was saying, "Oh, I read all these books by these generals and stuff." They have this military jargon.
So I want to ask a question that's sort of related to that. Because so you have this, so you talk about like one of the early cases, which I didn't know so much about, which was the Oxford University, which is kind of like ground zero for the whole project of smearing the Labour Party as anti-Semitic. And it's really interesting what you say. And in that case, you know, you've got very early days, so you've got John Landsman, and it's particularly a couple of his allies who are getting smeared hardcore in this, and he comes out fighting for them. And I think that's interesting because a lot of us know what happened, John Landsman's position right now, where he's very friendly with Jewish Labour movement, where he's joined in a lot of the smears. And I think like what you're good at pointing out is the way in which people shift and the way in which this whole thing eats people up and spits them out. And you say, like, this is a quote, zombie-like, the witch hunt seemed to consume its targets and change them utterly, blackmailed into capitulation. And I just thought it would be good to get your views on, like, you know, why does that happen? Is there any things that we can do to sort of help people to stay strong through these accusations when their friends are accused, when they're accused? Because it's really damaging to people. I've seen it with comrades who get accused and then really struggle with that and feel like maybe they are guilty. So are there things that you can say about that?
Yeah, it's difficult. Like I don't think there's an easy fix to this because and that's something I also get into in the chapter later on about the Crucible, the chapter called The Crucible, where, you know, I'm making these comparisons. And it wasn't my original, a lot of people made this comparison, the comparison to the Salem witch trials and the McCarthyist era, because it had the exact same dynamics of, well, you're a witch / you're an anti-Semite, but where's the evidence? You're denying that there's a witch, there's an anti-Semite, therefore you're a witch / anti-Semite. So it's this big circular thing. And there was a lot of fear around it, you know. And I think there's a larger question here, which I would like to see someone like Jackie Walker write. I know she's talked about it, but I would like to see someone like Jackie Walker write about this phenomenon whereby, and it's kind of outside the remit of my book, but in British society today, in large part because of the Israel lobby, but not only, I don't think, but in large part because of the Israel lobby, a statement that is perceived to be anti-Semitic, whether it is or not, but a statement that's perceived to be anti-Semitic is sort of career-ending in a way that a statement that is anti-Black racism or anti-Muslim prejudice, or, you know, anti-traveller prejudice and so forth, isn't. That this kind of hierarchy of racism that the Ford report confirmed exists in the Labour Party is not just the Labour Party. It's increasingly British society in general. And why is that? Well, it is a big question, and it's kind of beyond the remit of my book to answer that question. I think the Israel lobby has a large part to play in that, but I don't think it's just that. I think it's this kind of idea of that this is the anti-Semitism is the real racism, you know, that the actual racism that exists in our society today in an institutional fashion. It's a way to play that down and deny it, is to say, well, all these lefties, they claim to be anti-racist and they're always going on about all this woke stuff, but actually they all hate Jews. And that's a large part of the reason why it was so powerful, because it's just kind of a general right-wing weapon.
So I don't think it is, I don't like the term hierarchy of racism, because it starts from the assumption that anti-Semitism is being treated seriously and everything else isn't. And anti-Semitism is not being dealt with at all in this. So I think it's just racism. I think the reason why anti-Semitism is given a privileged space is because the anti-Semitism movement is simply another way of being racist, and ignoring Black people is another way of being racist, and being Islamophobic is another way of being racist, and they all are the same. So I don't like hierarchy of racism because it implies this is actually about dealing with anti-Semitism, as opposed to creating a narrative against anti-Semitism, which is actually a form of racism. That makes sense?
I think that's a really good point.
I mean, you say something about that in your book about, you know, what was happening in the Labour Party, and a lot of what is talked about as anti-Semitism is to do with Israel. And it becomes often arbitrary whether the person who's being accused of anti-Semitism is Jewish or whether the person who's accusing them of anti-Semitism is Jewish. So you talked about, who was it? Ryan?
Ryan.
Yeah, accusing a lot of JVL members, Jewish men and women Labour members, of being anti-Semites, even though she's not Jewish, and they are, and they're talking about their position on Israel. And because she's got a different position, she's calling them anti-Semites, and a lot of them were kicked out of the party. So it's really, I think, like, it's a smokescreen, yeah, to say like this is a problem of anti-Semitism on that we can get at the left because the left just don't want to be racist or don't want to be seen to be racist, and this is an issue that the logic I was thinking about, and maybe. I don't know if this is true, but I was trying to get this sort of in my head what the actual logic was of how people can perceive there being a reason why if you do hold a position that's against kind of where the British government is, say, on Israel, even sort of slightly, not that you want to totally get rid of Israel as a country, but just having like ideas like boycotts and things. If you take that kind of position and you are Jewish yourself, you can still be an anti-Semite in some people's eyes. I think because the idea is that there is a position shared amongst the majority of Jewish people in this country. This is how the idea goes, right? That they believe that Israel has a right to exist, and they broadly agree with what Israel is doing to maintain its position, right? And so even as a Jewish person, especially not as a Jewish person, if you're against that, you're going against the Jewish community. Now, I don't know, has there been any census on that? I don't know. But I think that's where people generally are, right? And so that, but the problem with that is that if that is a bad position, which I think it is, you can't change people's minds about it because you're not allowed to discuss it because that's anti-Semitic. So it's like you can't be progressive in that way of like trying to change, even if the Jewish community are in a position and it's the wrong position. You would want to sort of foster debate to move people towards the right position. You're not allowed to do that because Jews have decided, or in this position at the moment, which they weren't, maybe, as you sort of mentioned in the book, they weren't always. Zionism wasn't always so popular, but that's where we are now. That's where a lot of Jewish people are, and so to discuss that is anti-Semitic, I suppose. That's how I think people look at it.
You're right. I mean, that is how it's perceived, and I mean, I think Heather makes a really good point that this kind of, I like your phrase, Heather, of anti-antisemitism, that it is a way to just be racist, essentially, an acceptable way to be racist. Because, I mean, I don't get into it that deeply in my book, but I do have the chapter on non-Zionist Jews, left-wing, pro-Corbyn Jews within the Labour Party, who were disregarded and ignored and maligned, and as you said, even attacked as anti-Semitic or self-hating Jews. And I do show to an extent that, it's not, to an extent, I show the fact that it's not true that all Jews support Israel and Zionism. But I mean, to even go beyond that, like, the fact is that let's say for argument's sake, it is true. Like, why does it matter? It doesn't matter. Like, let's say hypothetically, the majority of Britain's Muslims supported Saudi Arabia and supported that. I mean, it's not an exact parallel, because Saudi Arabia is a Muslim state in certain ways, but there are some very important differences with Israel. Israel is Jewish in ways that Saudi Arabia is not Muslim. But be that as it may, let's say for the argument's sake, majority of most Britain's Muslims supported Saudi Arabia and supported its, discriminatory policies, its oppressive regime, its war in Yemen, all these kinds of things. Would anybody in public life in Britain care about that? Would it be perceived as Islamophobic to criticize Saudi Arabia? It wouldn't. It wouldn't.
But it's going to become Hindophobic to criticise India in a bit, right? The same dynamic is going to start.
They are trying that, yeah. And they had, some Saudi propagandists do try that. They do say, "Oh, well, you only criticise." I remember when Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist, was brutally murdered by the Saudis in the Saudi embassy in Turkey and dismembered, just absolutely killed blatantly on the orders of Mohammed bin Salman. There was a few Saudi propagandists who at first said, "Oh, this is Islamophobia. Why are you, it wasn't," when they were denying it, that it was them and that it was whatever rubbish they were saying. Oh, it was whatever they were saying. They were saying, "Oh, you're only criticizing us because you're Islamophobic." But nobody bought it. It didn't get any purchase at all. It was clearly a load of rubbish. And I would suggest that a large part of the reason that it happens, it's so powerful with anti-Semitism, and that it is easier to accuse Israel's critics of anti-Semitism, is because the vast majority of Jews in Britain are white. So I think that's what's behind it. But also the Israel lobby is kind of privileged in a way that the Saudi lobby isn't, because I think Israel has a unique kind of position in terms of US empire and in terms of its usefulness to Western foreign policy.
Yeah, I think there's a few sort of questions that we were thinking about before we did this that I think we should get into. One of them, because I think we need to go back a little bit, is you mentioned the lobby, the Al Jazeera TV show that was pretty well known to Labour members at the time. It was based in the UK. I didn't know there was a US version, but you cover it in your book. There's some really interesting stuff about that. But there's also some really interesting ideas about, firstly, as you say, how anti-Semitism smears worked in the US or didn't work so well. There was much more of a pushback against it. On that, I think it's interesting to see that if it wasn't anti-Semitism, there were other smears that worked. I was watching a podcast with some American lefties the other day, and they were talking about just basically Russiagate kind of stuff. Basically, in the US now, as here, if you're on the left and you have a leftist position, you can be just smeared as an anti-Semite because you supported A, B, or C. Somebody just for your support of somebody else, Corbyn, in fact. And in the US, it's often the case that people just say that, oh, you're a Russian bot or you're a Putin puppet for making left-wing points, right? And that's become a kind
about Bernie Bros as well. There was lots about Bernie Bros and narratives about people being abusive on Twitter and, being racist, being sexist, particularly the second time Bernie ran, in kind of attitudes to Elizabeth Warren and people being, responding to her on Twitter with a little snake emoji was seen as abusive. So I think you're right. I think there's a lot of smears. And there is one explanation as to why there was a lot of anti-Semitism smears, which is the smears of Jeremy Corbyn as sexist or Jeremy Corbyn as a bully didn't work. And if they had worked, we wouldn't have seen the kind of anti-Semitism witch hunt.
But they did work. And why did they work, I think, is a real interesting point that you kind of try and argue. You give some reasons why you think it might have been, why it was so effective. I think it's still quite a puzzle to me exactly what was going on, particularly when you lay out things like what was revealed in the UK version of the lobby about what was happening in the Labour Party. And you say in the book, so there was what's his name? The main Yeah, he was revealed to be working for the Israeli embassy.
No, he was actually working.
He was working for the Israeli embassy. He was revealed
to be plotting to, sort of half joking, plotting to overthrow a minister, right?
Yeah, a Tory minister.
Yeah.
But also a lot of his interactions in the the lobby expose are him discussing things with people in sort of Jewish labor or pro-Israel labor organizations, right?
Yeah.
To create problems for Corbyn's leadership and people that are around Corbyn, right?
Yeah.
This is all revealed. The Tories the government and I guess Labour wanted to wash their hands of it. He was sent back to Israel and they said, case closed, right? But there was a call, I didn't realize this, you say in the book, there was a call for an investigation internally in Labour into what was going on with basically the Israel lobby, with people from the Israel embassy and the Israel government networking, giving information, plotting, I guess, with organizations within the Labour Party to bring down the Labour leadership. And you talk about this being, basically a foreign power. And in this case, in many sort of Labour leaderships and Tory leaderships have a very pro-Israel line and with the Israeli government on many things. Corbyn wasn't. So in that case, it was an aggressive it's a foreign power meddling in internal affairs of the Labour Party. They didn't investigate it though.
Yeah. What's really interesting about that, and you're right, it's really easy to forget that statement. And it was actually made by Emily Thornberry, of all people, who later came out as this great supporter of Labour Friends of Israel and said she was a Zionist and all this kind of stuff.
Well, they all did at the end. That goes back to Heather's point about people sort of, John Landsman. I mean, you have to sort of like Rebecca Long Bailey, you have to sort of do that in the end, right? To stay in.
Well, that's what it seems. So it's interesting because, I remember at the time, because obviously, at the time back at the beginning of 2017, I knew the Al Jazeera film was about to drop because obviously, I was in it. I hadn't been able to say anything. It was a big secret and all that. And I was on camera, one of the talking heads in the film. So I knew it was about to come out. And before the first episode dropped, they clearly, Al Jazeera briefed some of what's going to be in the film to the Daily Mail, of all people. Well, it was the Mail on Sunday, but they fed it to the Mail on Sunday and it worked. They got a really good front page on the Mail on Sunday. And they did that by focusing on the Conservative Party aspects of the film. So yes, Shai Mashat was conspiring with a civil servant who was working for a pro-Israel MP, this Israel lobby MP, Rob Halfon, who's incredibly, he's part of Tory Conservative Friends of Israel and all this. And he's very well known for making pro-Israel speeches in Parliament. And so his aide, who's also a civil servant, and Shai Mashat were caught on camera. And they were using kind of jokey language, but they were very serious about it. They wanted to take down Alan Duncan. They wouldn't have liked Crispin Blunt either. They had a list of MPs they wanted to be taken down, not, assassinated, but politically taken down. And, the civil servant, Maria Strozolo, she said, we can have a little scandal perhaps. And that's quite, again, light-hearted language, but she's serious. If whether or not they actually got down to the nitty-gritty of being able to do it, it's hard to say because obviously this came out. But that's really insidious what she was saying, because of course Alan Duncan was the first, whatever you think of him politically, and I don't think a lot politically, although I respect his opinion on Palestine to an extent. And to be honest, he's quite a forthright guy. He said some really interesting stuff in his memoir, but although obviously he played a very bad part in the arrest of Julian Assange. But anyway, be that as it may, he was one of the first, I think he was the first Tory MP to come out as openly gay. So what she's saying is possibly an allusion to that, which is quite insidious, really. And so, yes, so anyway, to get back to the point is that the initial headlines of this film, it was quite a big headlines for a few days in mainstream media, were all focused on the Tory party and what they were trying to do to manufacture this kind of, plot, or how to take, the words were to take down Alan Duncan, who was a serving senior government minister at the time by a hostile foreign power. Now, so what the initial response of Jeremy Corbyn's front bench was to call for this inquiry, as you mentioned. And Emily Thornberry's statement was quite strong. She said, quote, she called it, quote, improper interference in our democratic politics and by Israel. And she said, quote, this is a national security issue, you know? So that is really strong language. And then, Jeremy Corbyn similarly called for an inquiry. But then a few days later, when the first episode of the film dropped, that all seemed to go away from Labour, unfortunately. For whatever reason, I can't say why, I don't know. I can't say as in I don't know. Because, a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's circle are kind of gagged from talking because of various legal cases that are going on at the moment and so forth. So it's hard to know all the internal dynamics exactly, but for whatever reason, it went away. What I suspect, and I say in the book, is that once it became clear that most of the lobby series was actually focused on the Labour Party, that made it harder. It probably made it harder for them to call for, well, if they were going to, sustain that call for an investigation into improper interference in our democratic politics, and in the Labour Party, now where would that have to start? It would have to start with Labour Friends of Israel, number one, which is very clearly a front group for the Israeli embassy, as is very clear in the film, and the Jewish Labour movement. So, at the time when Corbyn was trying to sweep all this anti-Semitism smear campaign under the rug, that was not going to be the way he was going to go, unfortunately.
Okay, so yeah, I was interested in the way you in the book identify these kind of turning points like that. I guess key points where something different could have been done. I think there was a different choice, and that wasn't the road they went down. Another one is with Margaret Hodge, and when she called Jeremy Corbyn a racist and anti-Semite in Parliament, and then repeated that in a newspaper interview, and it's like, disciplinary action could have been taken against her, or legal action could have been taken against her. And a phrase you have is the muscular counter-narrative was never built, which is absolutely the problem. And one of the things that we've been trying to do, partly through this podcast, I think through our own work on different channels, is to build a muscular counter-narrative, and your book is doing that, obviously. But I also feel like I'm not sure how much things could have been different. Given the way the party was, the party staff was all opposed to Corbyn. The NEC was opposed to Corbyn until 2018. So for most of his leadership, the PLP was obviously really against. The grassroots was equivocal on this issue, and the representatives of the grassroots, the dominant one with Momentum, was really equivocal. How far could Corbyn have just stood up at the beginning and said, "Oh, fuck you" to the Jewish Labour movement? Could he have said, Ken Livingstone's staying in the party? I don't care that most of the Jewish left don't support him. Just he's staying. I'm going to sue the fuck out of Margaret Hodge, even though John McDonnell thinks that's a bad idea. How much were these realistic choices of things you say?
Well, I'm laughing, but I agree to an extent. What I would disagree with slightly is that I don't think the grassroots was. I don't think there's much evidence the grassroots was equivocal on the issue. I think there was certainly doubts around it. But if you look at, look, who knows how much credibility you should put into opinion polls, as we know. But if you look at the polling of the membership, the Labour Party membership all the way through, it never, ever believed any of this. It never, and this, to be honest, look, as you know, I can say this now. As you know, I've reported this all along, right? And my great fear all along was, and maybe this was wrong on my part in the sense that I should have had other fears, but my great fear was that the grassroots would start to believe this, that, maybe there's something in this, and Corbyn, there's no smoke without fire. Maybe Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, and I don't think there's any evidence that I know of that his supporters, his mass base of supporters, ever believed that. So I quote some of the polling, and I did several articles throughout it, throughout the period, looking at the polling, and it always showed very big majorities saying, and actually got more and bigger saying they didn't believe it. And by the end, it was there was like 90% of Momentum members saying it was. They said even more than I would have said, which was that like it was all invented, or either invented or exaggerated. So like I don't think there's much evidence of that.
I think on the ground, I don't know, because I'm talking about my own CRP, and
right.
There were people who had lots of people who had doubts. So lots of people who advocated for the IHRA definition. This was strategically the best thing to do. There were lots of people who said, well, you know, we should listen to what the Jewish community is saying, as well as knowing that this isn't as big a problem as people are saying. So that's what I mean. Like, if you ask a start question, do you think this is all it's cracked up to be? People will say, no, it isn't. But when you're into the detail, it was tough, like making the case sometimes with people, even people who were solid. A lot of people who were taking the Owen Jones position of maybe we should soften what we say, not mention the word Zionism. These kind of things were quite common. That split that you say that the people who were on the other side of this were trying to create between softer and harder support for Corbyn, softer and harder support for Palestinians, I think was really...
Yeah, it was
really
real. Like, it was successful in that sense, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, there was like, you don't have to convince the majority that it's true. There just has to be enough doubt spread. And yeah, it was definitely successful in that respect. Which, you know, was again a similar dynamic to, I'm glad you mentioned the UCU case, because yeah, it was a very similar dynamic there, where, you know, yes, we've kind of proven this is all nonsense, but at the same time, the damage has been done. Yeah, I think, you know, look, I'm not a politician, I'm a reporter, you know, I just call it like I see it. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I try and get it as right as I can in terms of the facts. I mean, look, I know that Corbyn was in a... I very much, although I think he made mistakes and I put them in the book, I like the guy. You know, I've got a really soft spot for him. I think he's basically a good guy. I think his heart's in the right place, and I think he's even got the right political instincts a lot of the time. And I don't know whether he would have... The fact is, I don't know. I don't know whether he would have been successful or not. But, you know, the old saying of like, if you don't fight, you know, if you fight, you might not win, that's for sure. But if you don't fight, you're definitely going to lose. On this issue, and this issue alone, I don't think Corbyn's team fought. They really conceded the field.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it again in terms of the abuse dynamics here, and obviously in a situation of abuse, people have different reactions. You know, they fight, or they fawn, so they concede. So Corbyn has obviously sort of, I think he tried to ignore it for a while, and then he sort of conceded towards the end. But I do get what you're saying, Heather, because although obviously it makes sense to fight it, in the climate that he was in, would that not have immediately been used against him? I mean, it would have been possibly even worse if he'd fought back in that climate. I mean, that's what I felt when I was kind of reading it.
I think that's true, absolutely. But at the same time, what would it have done to us? And I don't mean us four. I mean, you know, all the people that we know, his grassroots base. That was always his superpower. That was why he won in the first place. It wasn't because of fucking Owen Jones and Aaron Bastani and these people. That was why he won the leadership, because he had 200,000 people joining the Labour Party, even though a lot of them probably hated the Labour Party, just to support him. If he'd said, fuck off the Jewish Labour movement, it is very polite Corbyn way.
Yeah.
If he'd done that, then it would have energized his supporters, and that was what was missing in 2019. That was what wasn't there in 2019. That was there in 2017.
Well, that's a bit I disagree with you about. Okay, that's the one little bit of the 2019 was a phenomenal campaign. There was more people out. There was more energy than I've ever seen before in my life. So I don't think that energy was lost. It was tougher. It was horrible. I mean, it was really cold, it was really dark, it was raining a lot of the time when people were canvassing. When you would get people on the phone to talk to them, it was horrible. A lot of times because of Brexit, sometimes because of Kashmir, and sometimes because of anti-Semitism, and sometimes just because of a kind of general toxicity that attached to the Labour Party and a lack of trust. But the energy was totally there. I don't think people felt like, I still don't think people feel like Jeremy's let them down. I think that's why we're being a bit hard on you on this bit, is because I think
it's fine.
I feel like you're a little bit tough on Jeremy in the book, and maybe I kind of feel a need to I think we all feel a need to defend Jeremy, which I think is really interesting psychologically about where he sits in our imaginations. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I do think the energy was there. And I don't know, I go back and forth on it about whether it was possible, because ultimately what had to be said was Zionism is racism. And therefore we won't have organisations like Labour Friends of Israel in the Labour Party. That's the only consistent way of doing it that I can see. And
I would have liked to have seen Jeremy Corbyn say Zionism is racism, but I can accept that he wasn't going to say that. I don't think that's so much the issue. I think the issue is more that, very simply, that he took a massive L on the issue. That's basically, and he didn't fight, We're in the 2017, on that issue specifically, in the 2017 election, I'm sure he had lots of people around him after the Manchester bombing saying, oh, look, you have to drop all this anti-war stuff and just condemn the bombers. But he didn't. He didn't listen to those siren voices that I'm sure were there. And he said, just came out with the traditional principled anti-war position of, yes, of course, the bombers are the ones responsible, but at the same time, British foreign policy plays a factor in this. And unfortunately, these things are going to keep happening until we get out of the Middle East, essentially, is what he said. And that was massively popular. People, just the electorate in general. I don't mean us like campaigners and stuff. I mean, in the electorate. And so, if Jeremy Corbyn was able to stick, the problem was I hear what you're saying. I'll think about that more. But to an extent, I don't want to. I feel really bad making this comparison because it's not fair. But there was a maybe slightly little bit of a Neil Kinnocky aspect where he was kind of backpedaling a bit, and so that is not. I don't think that is a way to win. Essentially, that's what I'm trying to get at.
But for me, I mean, I agree with you, but I feel like it's a bit of a paradox. Like, Heather, it was so interesting what you were saying about how we feel the need to kind of jump in there. And I think this is something you say in the book, Asa, as well, about how the left are such good targets for this. Because I think the fact that Corbyn is respectful in what he says, sometimes he's not forceful enough as we would want him to be on issues, but that's part of his appeal because he listens to people. And it's like a paradox, isn't it? Because sometimes I've sat there and thought, I wish you'd just say it. But then I feel like, I don't know, a lot of people argue, don't they, he should have been much harder from the start on his critics. But then I just don't know if he would have the same, it's just a paradoxy kind of thing. I like that about him. I like that certain people on the left are able to listen and they want to learn and they want to try and improve. And I feel like it's just this awful cycle because it doesn't work when you're up against bad faith actors. And I don't really think we have any sort of playbook for how to do that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that. It was definitely a massive part of his appeal was that he wasn't a normal politician who would have just sort of barged his way through the Labour Party, I suppose. But then again, Ken Livingstone was, he wasn't a normal politician, but in his prime, he was a political fighter, and he was massively popular. He was incredibly popular, and he won even without the Labour Party's backing. Eventually taken down by the right-wing media, of course, partly because of an anti-Semitism smear campaign, actually, which I didn't really get. I didn't get into the book. You have to cut these things off somewhere. But yeah, I mean. Yeah, you're right. This is a really good point, Claudia. Like it is a paradox that he was different, and that was a large part of his popular appeal. That he was. I mean, I said this on another podcast the other day. He's kind of, although he's not a religious man and he's probably not technically a pacifist, he comes from that kind of sort of English radical Christian pacifism tradition where, that's kind of his whole vibe, and that's great, and I respect that and everything, but to and I honestly, I'm not, that sounds a bit flippant, but I do. I think that's an honourable position. But, unfortunately, it got to the point where it just was leading to, for whatever reasons, it was leading to ridiculous decisions where you're basically embracing your enemies and keeping your friends away. Like, for example, everybody in JVL, or most of the leading people in JVL, had known Corbyn personally for years. Corbyn didn't hold one public meeting with JVL. I know from sources that there was essentially clandestine meetings going on, clandestine contacts going on. And they just couldn't, why? And at the same time, he was having, him and John McDonnell were going to the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News to be interviewed because of whoever was giving them the advice. John Lansman was saying, "Oh, you've got to engage with the Jewish community," and then how did that work out for him? It ended up with these hostile front pages saying "not good enough," and just attacking him more. So to an extent, you're becoming your own worst enemy, and it's you can't win elections that way,
I was going to say, I think the problem that you face, or we all face, is not really knowing exactly what the effect was, right? Because your argument of capitulating to this position was so damaging is built off the back of it was the anti-Semitism issue that itself was damaging to the movement, right? If you say, well, actually nobody cared and it was all Brexit, then does it really matter that he lost so much ground on this? And so without really knowing, because I think what's really interesting is at the end of the book, you talk about that census that was done about the 2019 election and why people didn't vote for Labour and didn't vote for Corbyn. And some of those questions, the way they're phrased, are quite interesting. So I think that the top one was just a general lack of leadership, or him not having leadership quality, right? Which feeds into not being able to deal with his own backbench or able to fight big narratives in the media like anti-Semitism. So I think that certainly his reputation was tarnished. Whether you thought he was an anti-Semite or whether you thought it was anti-Semitism in Labour, his inability to deal with that issue did play into the election to some degree, but we don't know exactly how much. So to wager whether it was worth doing that or not is very difficult without knowing exactly what was lost in the process. I think what's definitely a big problem is what's happened since then, and how, because they lost. So if Labour had won that election, it wouldn't have mattered at all, right? That he'd given so much ground to all of these things, right?
It would, because it would have been used to bring him down after he won.
Oh yeah, apart from that,
just that small thing, right?
Thing. Yeah. But as it is, that's true. But the losing of the election, whether it was because of anti-Semitism or not, it's now part of the narrative that the good people of Britain saw that there was an anti-Semite trying to become the leader of the prime minister, and they said no, not on my watch, right? And that's part of the narrative now. And so going forward, the left wing, the Labour Party is just, you can't do anything because you immediately get expelled for being anti-Semite. So all of that is now sort of written in as the sort of part of British contemporary life.
And it's worse than the Labour Party because it's affected everything.
Yeah.
It's affected, the IHRA has, and I mentioned the case about the big ride for Palestine in the book, that this is gone far beyond the Labour Party now, and it was always about more than the Labour Party anyway, and more about Jeremy Corbyn in the first place, which is why I followed this case for so long as I did, because I could see it was going to have negative effects on the Palestine solidarity movement and on British life really in general, and just the world really, because it's become, because of the victory, the Israel lobby's victory against Jeremy Corbyn, as they claimed it themselves. It's not Asa Winstanley that's saying that. I'm just reporting what they're saying. That is a massive win for them. And they've moved on to other areas of life. They've moved on to, universities.
Goldsmiths.
Yeah,
the whole of NUS, right?
University of Bristol, the NUS, yes, exactly. Roger Waters, they're trying to stop Roger Waters from performing in Manchester. You know, everything, you know. So, I mean, they're going to have a problem with Roger Waters because he doesn't have a political party that can kick him out. He's got enough money where he can sue them, like he did successfully in Frankfurt. So, yeah, but it's a massive problem, and it's going to be an ongoing issue, which is why I wrote the book, because I mean, it took me ages to get this book published. Like, as you can imagine, that it was difficult to find a publisher.
Yeah.
And I actually started. I mean, you know, I've been doing. It's based on my reporting, as you know, but the actual writing of the book itself began at the end of 2019. It didn't take long to write. Certainly not the first draft. It was finding a publisher was what took a long time to write. But when I started writing it, Corbyn was still a leader, but I could see where it was going, and I could see that, you know, he was almost certainly going to lose the election, and that that was going to have, after everything that's happened with this smear campaign, which is not about anti-Semitism, as we all know, really, certainly not about genuine anti-Semitism. That it was going to have a massive negative effect on everything, and here we are, you know, 4 years later, and it's still 3.5 years later, and it's still going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what it's doing. I mean, disturbing, but there was just before the local elections in London, last year, I guess. There was reports done on different boroughs by a kind of consultancy which help developers get things through planning. And so I read the one on Hackney because I thought that's interesting. And the one on Hackney says that the council is resolutely pro-development, which of course means pro-developer. And it kind of goes into some nitty-gritty on this. It says despite some campaigns in the local area on housing, and also despite the fact there's been a kind of left-wing influx into the Labour Party. And it says the National Party is now helping out because they've suspended the former secretary of Hackney South, Heather Mendick. And it's so weird because, of course, this is not about anti-Semitism, you say. It's about housing. I mean, a lot of this is being, I know locally, and lots of examples of where the most pro-housing campaign councillors are got on anti-Semitism. Because what the councils don't want is people are going to challenge their pro-development agenda. So, and anti-Semitism is the easy thing to latch onto. But because so many people were so equivocal about anti-Semitism, the fact that it's been allowed to play out in this kind of horrific way in Labour that's just gone so over the top, so all-consuming, means it now has much more power when it's being turned on the student movement, which is now isn't really about the left, isn't really about stopping housing campaigning in local government and all that kind of stuff, and stopping anti-capitalist politics in national government. Now it is about Palestine again and about BDS, but it's harder to deal with because we've accepted so much, we've conceded so much ground.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, and I think that's just another example. It's an example. I mean, in the book I call the Israel lobby the vanguard, a reactionary vanguard of the right, really, of certainly of the Labour Party right. And the State of Israel, and before the State of Israel was founded, the Zionist movement always tried to portray itself as a useful tool to empire. So Theodor Herzl actually began starting to reach out to the Ottoman Empire. Didn't get very far with it, but once the British occupied Palestine, famously, there were just immediately before there was the Balfour Declaration, and the Zionist movement always tried to portray itself as a useful tool to empire and to sort of latch onto it in that way and to improve its fortunes in that way. And I think, I think the history of that actually worked out to be more complex than that. and that, you know, at one point, the Zionist movement, the Zionist militias were actually at war with the British Empire within Palestine, as we know. And I mean, look, my view is that this is beyond the scope of the book, but I don't think it's necessarily that simple as Israel being always a useful tool for the US empire. I think there's definitely been some contradictions there, like we see with, for example, there was the whole Jonathan Pollard scandal of the American who sold, he was a part of US naval intelligence who sold American military secrets to the Israelis and so forth. And so there's a complicated history there, and there's contradictions. But nonetheless, there's no doubt that at times that Israel has portrayed itself and has been useful for British Empire and for the American Empire at times. And certainly now that is how, you know, there's a lot of ideological alignment in the United States with Israel on the political level. And I think that is a large part of this, because, you know, the Labour Party right is incredibly Atlanticist. And so now the role that Zionism plays within the Labour Party especially is as this kind of vanguard of imperialism, really. It's such a useful weapon. It's such a useful weapon for them to be able to say, you know, attack how, like, I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm staggered to hear that they're using the fact that you were removed from the Labour Party as some kind of weapon against you in a campaign against predatory developers, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, the more
it's so useful for them. They're not going to give it up. Yeah. It has to be fought.
Exactly.
You know,
it's so convenient. As soon as they want to get rid of anybody because they're worried about them on any level in the Labour Party, they can always find a link, and it's so effective. Because I think if you're Jewish, it's a little bit easier, because I think if you're Jewish, you don't think, I wonder if I'm anti-Semitic, I wonder if they have a point. You just kind of know you're not. Whereas if someone's not Jewish, they think, well, maybe I did do blood libel without realising it. Even though I've never had blood libel in my life.
Yeah, because people generally don't understand. I'll tell you a really funny story, right? I heard the other day of I don't think I can name it, but there's a bookshop in London, and they have a lot of pro-Palestinian books there, and they had a flag up in the window saying "Free Palestine, boycott Israel," something along those lines, and they started to get clearly the Israel lobby like mobilized against them in some way on one of their mailing lists somewhere. And one of the various Zionist organizations, I don't know which one, but they had a steady flow of people, with all due respect to nice Karens, but Karens coming along. I feel quite bad for people who are called Karen, but anyway, you know what I mean. Karens coming along and saying, this is terrible, you have to remove this flag. And the shopkeepers were like engaging with them and saying why. And I was told the other day, right, that one of these people clearly didn't have a clue, and she responded to say, you know, the shopkeeper said, well, why do I have to take this down? And the person said, oh, I don't know, it's anti-something. So they didn't even know what anti-Semitism, they didn't even know the word anti-Semitism, let alone understand what it was. It's anti-something. So it's like, it's crazy. This is where we've reached.
I mean, I think for my generation, I mean, I wasn't aware of this as much as like Heather and Daniel were, and I kind of got interested in it when it was almost like it was quite an end point, really, wasn't it? It was quite far in, and certainly in our generation, you did become quite fearful. Genuinely, you know, I remember when I first started learning about this, I started learning about it because I was thinking, oh gosh, I support Corbyn. Am I anti-Semitic? I know that sounds really bizarre, but I was thinking, and I didn't want to be like that, because, you know, you should unlearn things like that. And it was through that research I was doing that I started to think, wait a minute, something's off here. And that's how I found Heather's work and got into Heather's thing. But for our generation especially, I think we're so keen on the left to not, it's an awful thing to be called, but more than that, you don't want to be causing harm to anyone. So it's a particularly wicked thing to do because it scares you away. And a lot of younger people now, especially, you know, when you talk about Jeremy Corbyn, they've almost made his name like a kind of dangerous association with anti-Semitism. So people who are new into politics and younger are almost fearful. And I felt that myself when I first watched Heather's video. I feel awful now because I love you, Heather. I think you're awesome. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, these people are saying she's a crank, she's this and she's that. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I better be careful with this that I'm watching in case I get sucked in. And I was sucked in because you were telling the complete truth. But there is a fear around it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the early cases as well, like the Ken Livingstone case, which you go into a lot in the book, is still a really complicated one for a lot of people. I think for those sorts of reasons. Yeah. That it's like, you know, it's talking about things that people don't know much about, which is the relationship between Zionists and Nazism, which is complicated and contested and all of that. And people feel very uncomfortable talking about it. And I think a lot of people are clear because of it.
And I do get into the detail. I really like that chapter. That was probably my favourite to write because I had to get into the research in a way. It gave me opportunity to get into that research in some detail in a way that I hadn't to, you know, a great extent. And but I think I do prove, like, historically that what Ken Livingstone said was basically correct. But I think more important than that is just the fact of, like, well, let's say he was wrong. Like, let's say he got something wrong. Why does that mean he has to be expelled from the Labour Party? Like, why is the immediate response of what let's say Diane Abbott's letter was badly worded. I'm not taking a position one way or the other. But so what? Like, why are they then immediately suspended from why is that the response? You know, it's why can't we discuss these things? You know, it's not. It's history. It's or definitions of racism. You know, these things should be. And that fear that you described, Claudia, is absolutely real. You know, definitely, and it's very big. And I've heard it from so many people. The same thing from my sources over the years, and I know the process that you mean as well of. You know, see people kind of online who write about or talk about these things, and specifically around Palestine as well, especially where it's people are legitimized. And yeah, there is weird stuff on the internet that is dodgy, you know. And so of course you have to discern what's right from wrong, and what's correct and what's incorrect. And there is racism out there, and there is anti-Semitism out there. Of course it exists, real anti-Semitism. But you know, I guess I'm just trying to challenge the silencing of discussion of a lot of these things.
I think that comes back to, and I found this when I was sort of trying to get my head around it, sort of during the Corbyn era, like not having an official, like you say, a robust response from the leadership. So you watch, you know, people like, oh, you should watch The Lobby, or you should read this article by some guy that's, you know, can't get published in The Guardian, so they've got their own blog. And like, I don't know who this guy is. It's a weird blog. It's a weird Al Jazeera. It's a weird TV channel. Like, it's kind of, what is this? Is this like just some kind of fantasy bullshit to cover the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semite and no one wants to admit it, right? And that's, you get into that headspace.
Yeah.
And particularly as there was you didn't hear anything from Corbyn or from the Corbyn's team, or from, and you get into this a bit, some of the more legitimate left-wing media figures who we shan't name today, but we'll name them next time.
Because we have a rule, don't we, that we have to mention Owen Jones in every podcast.
Yeah, we have to mention Owen Jones.
Yeah,
arbitrary to what I was saying. Just
mention.
Just list some people that we have to mention. Owen Jones, we have to mention.
Yeah.
Rachel Riley. She didn't. She didn't help the situation. I thought Countdown's pretty. That's a mainstream show, you know.
I've just done a text search and I didn't mention her in my book.
Yeah. Get ready.
I think that was very wise. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Don't mention her in the book, but mention Mike Gapes.
It didn't come up, you know. I suppose I didn't want to feed her ego. There might be an illusion there somewhere to her.
I mean, she's not really in
I
the
thought you were going to say
Labour
she's not
Party
real.
stuff, is she? No, she's not really in the Labour Party circuits. Maybe she's AI.
Look, we've been going on for ages. Asa, you should come back on. We should have another conversation. This was great.
I would love to. Yeah.
We didn't even get to speak about Ruth Smeeth. So there's an hour there to be done another time.
Oh, yeah, certainly. Ruth Smeeth, Strictly Protect. Yeah.
Strictly Protect.
You have to say in the middle, it's Ruth Strictly Protect Smeeth.
I thought it was like Ruth Smeeth Strictly Protect. It's like it's kind of like Esquire or whatever. It's like. Anyway, so your book came out yesterday, Weaponising Anti-Semitism. Right. Is it out in actual shops?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. You want to name them, or are you scared they're going to be?
I mean, look, if anyone is out there, and I haven't seen it in the wild in bookshops, but yes, it should be stocked from yesterday in bookshops.
But you can also get it online where?
That's right. Allbooks.com, orbooks.com, and
So we'll put links.
Obviously, this is a podcast, and you should listen to it as a podcast. You shouldn't be watching this video, but if you are watching the video version, there'll be links to all of this. I'm also going to put a link. So, Asa, you write for Electronic Intifada. That's where your main sort of place of writing things is, right?
And I have a Substack as well where people can pay me money and subscribe. All my stuff goes out on via email and the website on there, which is asawinstanley.substack.com.
Also, Electronic Intifada have a YouTube channel, and you made a great video about a year or maybe 2 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, for COVID. I don't know when it was, but you made a video about kind of some of the stuff you covered in the book, going through the Oxford Union stuff and things that we talked about today, and how this sort of narrative built up. It's a really good video. I'll put a link to that as well. And is that everything?
Do you guys have a Patreon or anything?
We do. Daniel's very reluctant to mention that. But he has a Patreon,
See, I work with Americans a lot of the time. That's why I say things like "you guys," right? So they're not shy about advertising these things. You have to do it. You have to do it.
Heather is a patron of mine.
Yes, I signed up as a patron before we started the podcast. And I haven't cancelled, so I now fund my own work.
It's
Oh, why not?
So I have
what
to
is
buy,
it?
like whenever I meet Heather, I have to buy coffee and everything because I'm totally indebted to her.
I feel like it would be, if I actually cancelled now, then like you maybe
that would be crushing.
It would. I feel bad.
Patreon is crushing to me.
Well, Daniel, since you're shy, I will tell your listeners and viewers that they should go to patreon.com/complaints on a plate and sign up as a monthly supporter of this wonderful podcast.
Thank you very much, Asa. I'm going to
keep that
clip. I'm going to keep record that and put that at the end of all our videos.
You should.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Great. Okay. Great. And as always, should we give a nice wave? And yeah. All right. Yep. See you later.